Chapter 14, the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System, we examine how the government controls money creation and thus aggregate demand. The core issues that we're going to talk about, which government agency is responsible for controlling the money supply, what policy tools are used to control the amount of money in the economy, and how are banks and bond markets affected by government's policies. What is the Fed? When we talk about Fed, we're talking about the Federal Reserve Bank. I'm going to talk about what the book says the Fed is, and I'm also going to kind of branch off a little at times and get in a little deeper as to what the Fed really means and what it really is and how it was set up. The Fed was created in 1913. It consists of 12 Federal Reserve banks, which act as the central bank for private banks in their regions and perform the following services. They clear checks, they hold bank reserves, they provide currency, and they provide loans. So basically what this means is that when banks need money, they go to their local Federal Reserve Bank to get money. They borrow the money from the Federal Reserve Bank and then lend that money out to us as average citizens, to businesses, to whomever. It's very important to recognize at this point that the book refers to the Federal Reserve as a government agency. That's actually incorrect. The Federal Reserve banking system, those are private banks. We need to be very clear on that. They are private banks. They were created by the government for the purpose of controlling our money supply. But the Fed is a private bank. We appoint the chair of the Fed. The government appoints the chair of the Fed. But it is not a government-run agency. Congress has very little supervisory power over the Fed. If you follow politics at all, you would know that there's been in the last 10 years some real friction between the government and the Fed, because the Fed doesn't really answer to the government, because once again they are a private bank. And so that's why there's always some confusion. Well, if the Fed is a government bank, why can't Congress find out what's going on over there? Because the Fed is immune from audit. The Congress can't audit the Fed. They don't really know what's going on. And once again, the reason is because it is a private bank with government authority to control our money supply. The structure of the Fed. The Fed Board of Governors is responsible for setting monetary policy. Monetary policy, the use of money and credit controls to influence macro outcomes. Board members are appointed to a 14-year term in 2-year stagger to ensure measure political independence, and one board member is appointed chairman for 4 years. That person is appointed chairman by the President of the United States. The current chair is Ben Bernanke. He is in his second 4-year term. It is assumed he will not take a third, but by the time you hear this, that will probably have already been decided. The Federal Open Market Committee, the FMOC, is responsible for the Fed's daily activity in financial markets. The FMOC meets monthly to review economic performance and to adjust monetary policy as needed. They are commissioned by the government to do their best to keep unemployment low and inflation low, while growing the GDP. That's what the FMOC is charged to do, and they have a few tools to do this. They can do this by controlling interest rates. The way that they control interest rates is through the amount, the cost, the interest rate that they charge the banks to borrow money. So if the Fed charges a bank 5% interest, the bank will typically charge you and I 8%. There's about a 3.5, 4% markup for profit for the banks, but also just so they can run their business. They have to make money to run their business. And so if they set the interest rate at 5, typically the average 30-year home mortgage rate will be about 8.5. Right now, they have set the interest rate at which they loan money to banks at 0. So that means that banks can essentially get the money for free, and then loan it out. That's to try and stimulate the economy by increasing aggregate demand, by getting more money into the system. So with interest rates at zero, that means that the average 30-year fixed home loan is about 3.5%. Once again, that 3.5% or so markup. So that's how they control interest rates. The Fed controls the money supply by using three policy tools. Reserve requirements. We talked about this in the video and in chapter 13, so I'm going to kind of skip that instead of talking about it a third time. Discount rates, which is another term for interest rates. We just talked about that. And open market operations. And that has to do with the bond market, and we'll get into that in a few slides. Once again, we've already talked about reserve requirements, so we're going to keep on moving. The discount rate, we talked about this a few slides ago. Profit-seeking private banks earn money by making loans, and they will always try to lend out all of their excess reserves. Once again, at the end of the chapter 13 PowerPoint, we talked about how banks have stopped trying to lend out all their excess reserves to protect the economy, and also there's a decreased demand for loans because the excess reserves are so massive. At times, a bank might fall short of satisfying the reserve requirement. It can borrow excess reserves overnight from another bank and pay interest, the federal funds rate. It can borrow reserves overnight from the Fed and pay interest, the discount rate. So if the bank needs more money to loan out, they can borrow it from the Fed at the discount rate, which is the interest rate that the Fed sets. That's the floor of that 3.5% profit that a bank will make. So the discount rate right now is 0, so they can get money whenever they need it. The rate of interest the Fed charges for lending reserves to private banks, so we've already discussed that. Open market operations. This is the principal mechanism to directly alter the reserves of the banking system. So first part of this is the portfolio decision. The choice of how and where to hold idle funds. There are several choices. Cash, savings accounts, stocks, and bonds. The last three may generate additional income in the form of dividends or interest. Should you keep your idle funds in a savings account or purchase government bonds? So this is how the government influences where you will put your money, and where large mutual funds and hedge funds and people with lots of money, where they're going to put their money. And by controlling where they put their money, they control our economy to a degree. And they do this by making bonds more or less attractive. When bonds are very attractive, people will dump their money into bonds. And once again, the Fed is controlling where the money goes. By keeping bond rates low, they'll make sure the money stays out in the economy, which is one of the things they're doing right now. If the public moves funds from savings to bonds, reserves fall and vice versa. So when the Fed buys government bonds from the public, reserves increase. More loans can be made and the money supply grows. So this is one way the money supply grows, through bond purchase. So once again, when the Fed buys government bonds from the public, reserves increase because the Fed is buying something, so they are spending money, and that money goes to the public. Typically banks, individuals, when you buy government bonds, Federal Reserve bonds, that money, when you buy it, goes, when the government buys the bonds from you, that money goes out to you and to the, for circulation to improve aggregate demand. When the Fed sells government bonds to the public, the reserves decrease because you're giving the Fed money, which takes it out of circulation. So if the Fed wants to decrease the money supply, they sell government bonds. Fewer loans can be made and the money supply shrinks. This happened during the early 80s. When inflation got out of control, the Fed started to increase bond rates, which means people wanted to buy bonds. If any of you were around then, you remember bond rates at 15, 16, 17%. I think most of us in this day and age, if bonds are being sold by the Fed at 16%, we're going to jump in. Well, and when we would jump in and put our money into something that's going to pay 16% a year, which is incredible, a lot of people got rich and retired off of that. When the if the Fed were to sell things that high, all that money that we would give the Fed to buy those bonds would decrease the money supply and drop inflation. And inflation was very high in the early 80s. And by increasing those interest rates and selling bonds, they were able to bring inflation under control. The chairman of the Fed at that time was named Paul Volcker. And it was his policy to do this. And he received a lot of flack for it. People didn't think it would work. It did work, and it really helped everybody all the way around. The bond market. Bond is a certificate acknowledging a debt and the amount of interest to be paid each year until repayment. It's an IOU. People buy bonds because they pay interest and they're a safe investment. I don't want to get too deep into bonds here. I won't ask you anything on a quiz or a test about bond math. At least I don't think I will. But I really want to focus more on the Fed than the bonds. But it is important to talk about how they work. So if you pay $1,000 for a bond that pays out $80 a year and its yield is 8%, if its price fell to $900, the bond market, its yield would increase to 0.089 or 9%. The objective of open market operations is to alter the price of bonds and also their yields to make it more or less attractive as investments. So once again, this is just another example of of the Fed trying to control where we put our money by playing with bond prices. And the prices that bonds change right now are very small. The yields on bonds are less than 1% right now. They're just tiny. And so very few people have any money in bonds because the government wants that money circulating to increase aggregate demand, which will increase GDP, which will hopefully decrease unemployment, and to try and stimulate the economy. So they've really maxed out and are doing everything they can in the middle of 2013. Open market activity. The Fed can induce people to buy bonds by offering to sell them at a lower price, and the Fed can induce people to sell bonds by offering to buy them at a higher price. So once again, the Fed just controlling where we put our money. The Fed funds rate. The interest rate one bank charges another for an overnight loan of excess reserves. If the Fed increases reserves by buying bonds, the Fed funds rate falls. If the Fed decreases reserves by selling bonds, the Fed funds rate rises. I'm not overly concerned about the Fed funds rate. Once again, that's just banks charging how much money in interest you have to pay to get the reserves to cover loans. To be honest, this doesn't apply right now since banks have so much in excess reserves, they're not borrowing and using the Fed funds rate right now, but there will come a time again where they do. The last point, the Fed funds rate is a highly visible sign of Federal Reserve open market operations. Once again, by buying bonds or selling bonds, they control this rate, which once again controls the cost of money and how much in interest we're going to end up paying. To increase the money supply, once again, we talked about this a lot, I'll talk about it again. The lower reserve the requirement, they can lower the reserve requirements so banks can lend out more. They can reduce the discount rate, and they can buy bonds in open market operations. So we've talked about all of those. Decreasing the money supply, the Fed can raise the reserve requirements, increase the discount rate, or sell bonds in the open market operations. It's very rare that the Fed actually decreases the money supply, and we're a long way from that now. But if the banks were to start lending out all that money that they could lend out that we talked about in Chapter 13, we would have an inflationary situation, and the Fed would desperately try to decrease the money supply to compensate for that. In that case, these things would be put into place. Something else to consider with the Fed, if you notice any dollar bill, 10, 20, $1 bill, if you notice at the top, it says it's a Federal Reserve note. It doesn't say it's United States currency as it might say, like dollar bills used to say it was a silver certificate. So that meant that there was silver in a bank that backed up the value of that dollar. Right now it just says a Federal Reserve note. So that's the Federal Reserve, a private bank, issuing our money, controlling our money supply, and issuing currency. We gave them the right to issue currency in 1913. So all the dollar bills you have are from the Federal Reserve, once again, from a private bank that has been authorized by the government. And they have the Secretary of Treasury's signature there on the bill to show that they are authorized to offer that currency, and the United States government stands behind the Fed. But that currency, the Federal Reserve note, is backed by nothing other than full faith and trust in the U.S. government. So the days of having gold or silver or something of actual tangible value backing up currency are over. We may end up going back to those one day, but I always think it's interesting that we don't often know what that means when it says Federal Reserve note. That's just the Fed issued currency as authorized by the U.S. government.